What if the reason you're not where you want to be has nothing to do with luck, talent, or opportunity, and everything to do with the words you repeat every single day? You speak thousands of words daily, out loud, in silence, in thought, in reaction, in self-judgment, in hope, in fear. Most of them go unnoticed. But here's what changes everything. Your words are not neutral. They are instructions. They are neurological signals. They are identity declarations. They are programming in the world of personal development, mindset mastery, and subconscious reprogramming. People obsess over strategy, productivity, manifestation techniques, and high-performance habits. But very few stop to examine the most powerful mechanism shaping their reality blueprint: language. Not just motivational language. Not surface-level affirmations. I'm talking about the raw, repetitive, emotionally charged vocabulary you use when no one is watching, because your brain is always listening. When you say, "I can't," your nervous system registers limitation. When you say, "This always happens to me," your subconscious encodes victimhood. When you whisper, "I'm not good enough," your identity adjusts to match the declaration. And once identity shifts, behavior follows. Behavior creates results. Results reinforce identity. And the cycle continues quietly, invisibly, automatically. Most people believe reality creates their words. They think circumstances justify their internal dialogue. But neuroscience suggests something far more unsettling and far more empowering. Your language shapes perception. Perception filters possibility. Possibility determines action. Action builds outcome. Your words don't describe your life. They design it. And here's where it becomes deeply personal. Think about the way you speak to yourself when you fail, when you procrastinate, when you look in the mirror, when an opportunity appears and fear rises in your chest. Are your words expanding you or contracting you? Are they aligned with growth, abundance, emotional intelligence, and self-leadership? Or are they reinforcing scarcity, doubt, and self-sabotage? This is not about toxic positivity. This is not about pretending everything is perfect. This is about conscious language, neurovocabulary, the architecture of your internal world. Because every repeated word becomes a neural pathway. Every emotionally charged sentence becomes a preferred route in your brain. And over time, those routes become automatic. You don't rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your self-talk. The most dangerous words are not the loud ones. They're the familiar ones. The ones you've been repeating for years. The ones that feel true simply because they've been rehearsed so often. I'm just not disciplined. Money is hard to make. I'm bad at relationships. Success isn't for people like me. Each one sounds like a description. But in reality, each one is a declaration, a decree, a subtle but powerful act of creation. If language has the power to shape identity, and identity shapes destiny, then the question is no longer whether words matter. The real question is, what reality have you been unconsciously building with your own voice? Because before we talk about success, before we talk about abundance, before we talk about reprogramming your subconscious mind and unlocking your potential, we need to understand what actually happens inside your brain and inside your nervous system the moment a word leaves your mouth or crosses your mind. And that's where this becomes even more fascinating. And that's exactly why I need to ask you something before we go deeper. If this topic has already touched something inside you, if you've ever noticed how the way you speak to yourself completely changes your emotional state, then take a second and like this video. It's not just about supporting the channel. It's about signaling that this kind of content about mindset, reprogramming, and conscious language needs to reach more people who are fighting silent battles inside their own minds. And I genuinely want to hear from you. In the comments, tell me, have you ever caught yourself repeating a specific phrase when something goes wrong? Or when an opportunity shows up? Write something simple like, "I've felt this," or share the sentence that echoes most in your head. The moment you put it into words, you begin to take ownership of it. And awareness is the first step in rewiring your neural patterns. If you want to learn how to use language as a tool to build identity, prosperity, and internal power, if you want to master your inner dialogue instead of being ruled by it, then subscribe to the channel. Because here, we're not talking about temporary motivation. We're talking about neurovocabulary, neural pathways, identity shifts, and the science of reprogramming your subconscious mind so your reality starts aligning with your declarations. Now let's go deeper, because what I'm about to show you next will completely change how you hear your own voice. Now let me take you to the first layer of this transformation, because everything begins here. Most people believe that words are reactions. They think reality happens first, and then language comes after. Something goes wrong, so they say, "This never works." A bill arrives, so they say, "I'm always broke." A relationship ends, so they whisper, "I'm not enough." It feels logical. It feels justified. But what if I told you that in many cases, your words are not responding to reality, they are rehearsing it? Think about how often you repeat certain phrases without even noticing. "I'm terrible at this. I always mess things up. Success isn't for people like me." These aren't random thoughts. These are identity declarations. And identity is the most powerful force in subconscious reprogramming. Your brain is constantly scanning for evidence that confirms who you believe you are. So when your inner dialogue repeats a sentence, your mind begins building neural pathways to support it. That's how neurovocabulary works. The vocabulary you use shapes the neural architecture of your perception. This is where neuroscience meets mindset. Every time you verbalize a belief, especially with emotion, your brain encodes it more deeply. The amygdala and hippocampus become involved. The emotional charge strengthens the memory trace. Over time, that repeated language becomes a preferred neural pathway. And here's the part most people don't realize. Your brain doesn't distinguish very well between an external fact and a repeated internal narrative. If you say, "I can't," often enough, your nervous system begins to treat effort itself as a threat. Cortisol rises. Creativity drops. Motivation fades. And suddenly, the identity you declared starts producing matching outcomes. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine someone who deliberately practices identity-based declarations. Not empty affirmations whispered without feeling, but conscious, emotionally engaged language. I am capable. I learn fast. I create opportunities. When spoken with conviction, those phrases activate reward circuits. Dopamine increases. The prefrontal cortex becomes more engaged. You literally shift into a biochemical state of expansion. This isn't magical thinking. It's neural conditioning. It's subconscious reprogramming through intentional language. And this is why mindset is not about pretending everything is perfect. It's about understanding that your words are commands to your nervous system. They are instructions to your subconscious mind. They are blueprints for identity. When you repeatedly declare something, you are not describing your world. You are constructing it from the inside out. The language you choose becomes the architecture of your perception. And perception determines behavior. Behavior determines results. Results reinforce identity. That loop is happening all the time, whether you are conscious of it or not. Most people live inside an unconscious loop. They speak from old conditioning, old wounds, old fears. They inherited a neurovocabulary shaped by criticism, comparison, scarcity. Maybe you grew up hearing phrases like, money is hard to make, or people like us don't succeed, or don't aim too high. Those sentences don't disappear. They embed themselves in your subconscious mind. They become background noise. And without awareness, you start repeating them in your own voice. That's how generational language becomes personal imitation. But the moment you become aware of this mechanism, something powerful happens. You step out of automatic mode. You begin observing your inner dialogue instead of being controlled by it. And that observation alone starts weakening old neural pathways. Because awareness is the beginning of identity shift. Awareness interrupts the autopilot. I want you to gently reflect on something right now. What is the sentence you repeat most often when things get difficult? What is the default phrase that appears when you feel fear or uncertainty? Notice it, don't judge it. Just recognize that it might be more than a reaction. It might be a declaration. And if that declaration has been shaping your reality, then the question is no longer whether words matter. The question becomes how deliberately you are choosing them. If this resonates with you, you can write in the comments something simple like "I choose my words," or even share the phrase you are ready to release. Not as confession, but as awareness. Because in the next part, we're going to explore what actually happens inside your brain, chemically and neurologically, when you speak those declarations, and why the ratio between negative and positive language may be more precise than you ever imagined. Now let's go deeper, because understanding that words shape identity is only the beginning. We need to talk about what actually happens inside your brain when you repeat certain types of language, and why this is not philosophy, it is biology. When you speak a word, especially one loaded with emotion, your brain does not treat it as harmless sound. It processes it as data, as signal, as instruction. And depending on the emotional tone of that word, your nervous system shifts accordingly. When you repeat phrases like, "I can," "I'm capable," "I'm building something," your brain interprets those as signals of progress and possibility. The reward circuitry begins to activate. Dopamine is released. Dopamine is not just the pleasure chemical, like people casually say. It is the neurotransmitter of motivation and forward movement. It tells your brain, this direction is worth pursuing. It enhances focus. It sharpens clarity. It increases persistence. In other words, your language can biologically move you into a state of expansion. But now look at the opposite pattern. When you say, "I can't," "This always fails," "I'm stuck," your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, lights up. And the amygdala does not negotiate. It does not ask whether you're exaggerating. It reacts. It triggers a stress response. Cortisol rises. Your heart rate increases. Blood flow shifts away from higher reasoning areas and toward survival circuits. Your body prepares not to create, but to defend. And here is the dangerous part. This can be triggered by your own words. Even in the absence of real danger. That means every time you repeat a negative declaration, especially with emotion, you are putting your body into micro-states of survival. Not because something is chasing you, but because your language is signaling threat. Over time, this builds a baseline state. You begin living in subtle tension, subtle defensiveness, subtle contraction. And then you wonder why creativity feels blocked, why clarity feels distant, why opportunities seem harder to see. This is where the 5-to-1 principle becomes powerful. Research in relational psychology suggests that for every negative interaction, at least 5 positive interactions are needed to maintain relational health. And if that ratio applies to relationships between people, imagine how it applies to your relationship with yourself. Your inner dialogue is the longest relationship you will ever have. If your neurovocabulary is dominated by criticism, doubt, and self-attack, you are living in a 1-to-5 imbalance in the wrong direction. Think about your average day. How many subtle negative phrases slip through? I'm exhausted. I'm behind. I don't have enough. I'll probably mess this up. Now compare that to how many intentional, emotionally grounded positive declarations you make. Not toxic positivity, not denial, but grounded reinforcement. If the scale is tipped toward negativity, your brain chemistry reflects that imbalance. This does not mean you must suppress every difficult thought. That would be unrealistic and psychologically unhealthy. Emotional honesty matters, but awareness of ratio matters too. If you have a bad moment, you do not pretend it didn't happen. You recalibrate. You deliberately introduce 5 reinforcing statements for every one that contracts you. Not because you're lying to yourself, but because you are training your nervous system to spend more time in expansion than in defense doubt. And here's something even more fascinating. Emotional words are remembered more strongly than neutral ones. Studies on memory show that when a word carries emotional charge, the brain encodes it more deeply. So if you repeatedly say, "I'm a failure," with frustration, that emotional intensity strengthens the neural pathway. But if you say, "I am resilient," with genuine conviction and emotion, that pathway strengthens too. Emotion is the amplifier. Your brain remembers what it feels. This means you are not just speaking words. You are laying neural tracks. Every repeated phrase becomes easier to access. Every emotional declaration becomes a shortcut in your mind. Over time, your brain follows the most traveled path automatically. That's how subconscious reprogramming happens. Not in one dramatic moment, but through repetition with emotional intensity. So the question becomes more precise now. What emotional words are you rehearsing daily? Are they reinforcing scarcity or possibility? Defense or expansion? Survival or creation? Because in the next part, we're going to explore something even more powerful. The idea that language is not just influencing your internal chemistry, but actually performing reality. That when you declare something, you are not merely describing your world. You are altering it in real time. Now we arrive at something that shifts this conversation from psychology into something far more disruptive. Language does not merely describe reality, it performs it. This is where most people's understanding stops. They believe words are commentary, reflections, reactions. But what if your words are not mirrors? What if they are instruments? There is a concept in philosophy known as speech-act theory, developed by thinkers like J.L. Austin and later expanded by John Searle. The central claim is radical. Some statements do not describe reality, they create it. When a judge says, "I declare you guilty," that sentence does not report something. It changes the legal status of a human being. When someone says, "I do," at a wedding, those 2 words transform identity, rights, responsibilities, and social standing. The words are not symbolic. They are operative. Now, bring that closer to you. When you say, "I quit," you are not describing your state. You are performing quitting. When you say, "I forgive you," you are not commenting. You are altering relational reality. Language can execute. It can enact. It can move things from possibility into form. And this is where it becomes deeply personal. Every time you say, "I am not good enough," you are not simply venting. You are issuing a declaration. You are authorizing a version of yourself. You are performing limitation. The brain does not treat "I am" statements lightly. They are identity anchors. They become scripts. They shape perception. And perception shapes behavior. Most people believe reality happens first and words follow. But often, the sequence is reversed. You speak, then your nervous system organizes around what you've spoken. You declare, and your subconscious begins aligning evidence to support the declaration. If you repeatedly declare, "Nothing ever works out for me," your brain becomes highly efficient at filtering for proof of that narrative. Not because the world is conspiring against you, but because your perception has been tuned by your language. This is not mystical thinking. It is cognitive bias reinforced by emotional repetition. The reticular activating system in your brain helps filter what you notice, and it prioritizes what is emotionally significant and frequently rehearsed. So if your declarations consistently reinforce scarcity, rejection, inadequacy, or impossibility, your attention will be magnetized toward confirming those states. But here is the reversal point, and it is powerful. Declarations can be intentional. You can consciously choose identity statements that move you toward expansion rather than contraction. When you say, "I am building discipline," you are not claiming perfection. You are positioning identity in motion. When you say, "I am learning to trust myself," you are not pretending certainty. You are performing growth. Declarations are not about fantasy. They are about orientation. They direct your internal architecture. They instruct your nervous system where to stabilize. And when repeated with emotional congruence, not forced positivity, but embodied conviction, they begin shaping behavior in subtle ways. You start making decisions consistent with the identity you have declared. You begin noticing opportunities aligned with that internal shift. This is why careless language is expensive, and why intentional language is transformative. Because the most powerful speech acts are not spoken in courtrooms or ceremonies. They are whispered in your own mind. They are the silent "I am" statements you rehearse when you fail, when you succeed, when you look in the mirror, when you step into uncertainty. So ask yourself something honest right now. What identity have you been declaring without realizing it? What role have you been performing through repetition? Because in the next part, we're going to expose the invisible conversation that runs underneath everything, the internal dialogue that never stops, the silent script that either builds a prison or constructs a palace. Let's go deeper into that invisible layer, the one that almost no one talks about openly, yet everyone lives inside. Because if declarations shape identity, then the most powerful declarations in your life are not the ones you say out loud. They're the ones you repeat silently. There is a second dimension to language that is far more influential than public speech. It is your internal dialogue, the ongoing conversation you have with yourself from the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep. That voice that comments, judges, compares, anticipates, criticizes, justifies, and predicts. That voice is not passive. It is active. It is constantly issuing micro-declarations about who you are, what is possible, and what you deserve. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people are more verbally abusive toward themselves than they would ever dare to be toward someone they love. You miss a deadline and the voice says, "You always mess things up." You look in the mirror and it whispers, "You're not enough." An opportunity appears and it murmurs, "Don't even try. You'll embarrass yourself." These are not harmless thoughts. They are repeated speech acts shaping identity from the inside out. The subconscious mind does not distinguish sharply between external speech and internal speech. Neuroimaging studies show that when you think words, many of the same brain regions activate as when you speak them. So when you internally rehearse phrases like, "I can't," "I'm bad at this," or "people like me don't succeed," your nervous system still responds. Your body still contracts. Your stress hormones still shift. Your perception still filters through that narrative. Over time, this creates what we might call an identity loop. A belief produces language. That language reinforces the belief. The belief influences behavior. The behavior creates results that appear to confirm the belief. And the loop tightens. Not because it's true, but because it has been rehearsed. This is where neurovocabulary becomes more than a concept. It becomes a responsibility. The words you allow to circulate in your inner world are building neural pathways. Every emotionally charged repetition strengthens a circuit. If your internal script is saturated with criticism, your brain becomes fluent in self-rejection. If your script includes strength, resilience, possibility, your brain becomes more efficient at accessing those states. But there's another layer beneath even the words: tone. The emotional frequency behind your inner voice matters. A neutral observation like, "I made a mistake," feels very different from "I'm such a failure." The first allows correction. The second attacks identity. And when identity feels threatened, the nervous system goes into protection mode, which shuts down creativity, expansion, and risk-taking. Now imagine the cumulative effect of years of internal declarations. Imagine thousands of small, repetitive phrases layering into your self-concept. That is not random. That is construction. And construction can be redesigned. This doesn't mean suppressing negative thoughts. It means becoming aware of the internal narrator. Because once you observe the voice, you create distance from it. And distance creates choice. Instead of automatically accepting every internal statement as truth, you begin to ask, is this a fact, or is this an old script? Is this identity, or is this conditioning? Awareness interrupts automation, and interruption opens space for intention. When you start noticing the internal dialogue, you begin reclaiming authorship, not by forcing positivity, but by consciously selecting language that aligns with growth instead of fear. And that shift from unconscious narration to intentional declaration is where real transformation begins. Because what we're about to explore next is how emotion intensifies memory, and why the most emotionally charged words in your internal script become the hardest to rewrite. Now let's talk about something that makes this entire conversation even more serious: emotion. Because words alone are powerful, but words charged with emotion become engraved. Researchers at Columbia University conducted experiments where participants were asked to memorize lists of words. Some of the words were neutral, objects, everyday terms without emotional weight. Others carried strong emotional charge: love, betrayal, danger, marriage, loss. When tested later, participants overwhelmingly remembered the emotionally charged words with far greater clarity. The emotional intensity acted like glue for memory. Your brain is wired this way for survival. Emotion signals importance. When something carries emotional charge, the amygdala activates and tells the brain, "This matters. Store it." That is how trauma embeds itself. That is how formative experiences shape identity. And that is exactly how emotionally repeated language builds neural dominance. Now, think about this carefully. If emotionally charged words are remembered more strongly, what happens when the emotionally charged words you repeat every day are negative? When you say, "I always fail," with frustration. When you think, "I'm not good enough," with shame. When you whisper internally, "Nothing works for me," with hopelessness. You are not just venting. You are emotionally engraving. The repetition builds neural pathways. The emotion strengthens them. And the brain, seeking efficiency, begins defaulting to those pathways automatically. It becomes easier to access self-doubt than confidence. Easier to anticipate failure than possibility. Not because that is reality, but because that is the most emotionally rehearsed script. This is how auto-sabotage becomes unconscious. You don't wake up deciding to undermine yourself. You simply follow the strongest neural route available. And that route was built through emotionally reinforced language over time. But here is the inversion, and this is where hope enters the architecture. The same mechanism that engraves limitation can engrave expansion. When you repeat identity-based declarations with emotional sincerity, not robotic repetition, but embodied conviction, you begin constructing alternative pathways. When you say, "I am learning to trust myself," and you feel even a small spark of truth behind it, your brain registers that emotion. When you declare, "I can handle growth," with intention, Your nervous system starts recalibrating. Emotion is the recording device. It is not enough to mechanically say affirmations. The brain does not respond strongly to empty sound. It responds to felt meaning. That is why some people claim affirmations don't work. They are whispering them without emotional participation. But when language and emotion align, neural encoding deepens. Over time, emotionally rehearsed positive declarations begin competing with old circuits. And here is something important. The brain does not erase old pathways immediately. It builds new ones. With repetition, the new pathways gain strength. With emotional intensity, they gain durability. And eventually, the internal script begins shifting automatically. This is not instant magic. It is neuroplasticity. It is identity reconstruction. It is deliberate reprogramming of subconscious patterns through emotionally intelligent language. So if emotionally charged words are the ones that stay, what emotional frequency have you been feeding your inner dialogue? What tone dominates your internal narrative? Because in the next layer of this conversation, we're going to examine something even more confronting: why the mind sometimes clings to negative language as a form of protection, and how your nervous system may actually prefer familiar pain over unfamiliar growth. Here's where this becomes even more subtle and more confronting. Because if emotionally charged words shape neural pathways, then we need to ask a difficult question. Why would the mind cling to negative language in the first place? Why would someone repeatedly rehearse phrases that shrink them, limit them, or keep them small? The answer is not weakness. It is protection. Your nervous system is not designed primarily for success. It is designed for survival. And survival favors familiarity. Even if what is familiar is limiting, painful, or self-defeating, it still feels predictable. And predictability equals safety to the brain. If, at some point in your life, shrinking yourself kept you accepted, then the language of self-doubt becomes associated with belonging. If lowering expectations protected you from disappointment, then phrases like "it probably won't work anyway" become defensive shields. If minimizing yourself reduced conflict or rejection, then declarations of smallness start to feel stabilizing. Your shadow, the part of you shaped by early adaptation, does not necessarily want expansion. It wants safety. It prefers the known discomfort over the unknown possibility. That is why growth can feel threatening. Not because growth is dangerous, but because it disrupts identity stability. When you begin declaring new things, "I deserve more," "I am capable of abundance," "I am stepping into leadership," something inside you may resist. Not because those statements are false, but because they imply change. And change activates uncertainty. And uncertainty activates the survival brain. This is where many people misinterpret resistance as truth. They say, "It feels uncomfortable, so it must not be right." But discomfort is often the nervous system recalibrating. It is the old identity losing dominance. It is the shadow reacting to perceived risk. There is a psychological phenomenon known as identity coherence. The brain prefers consistency between who you believe you are and how you behave. If your internal language has reinforced, "I am not confident," then acting confidently creates friction. Not because you are incapable, but because you are stepping outside the declared identity. And the friction can feel intense. The mind might generate new doubts. The body might generate anxiety. Old phrases might become louder. This is not failure. This is the survival system attempting to restore familiarity. This is also why transformation requires compassion toward your own resistance. If you attack yourself for feeling doubt, you reinforce the very internal aggression you are trying to dissolve. Instead, you acknowledge the protective impulse. You recognize that at some point, self-minimization served a purpose. It helped you navigate a context. It kept you safe in a smaller version of yourself. But safety is not the same as fulfillment. And what once protected you may now be constraining you. So when you hear negative self-talk arise, instead of immediately fighting it, you can ask, what is this trying to protect me from? Rejection? Failure? Exposure? Loss of belonging? Because when you identify the underlying fear, you bring it into consciousness. And conscious fear loses some of its power. The goal is not to silence the survival voice violently. It is to integrate it, to thank it for its service, and then to choose language aligned with expansion anyway. That is where maturity in mindset begins, not in suppressing fear, but in moving with intention despite it. And this prepares us for something crucial. Because if negative internal language is often a strategy for belonging, then we have to examine one more dimension. How your words are connected not just to personal identity, but to relational loyalty, cultural conditioning, and inherited narratives that may be operating beneath your awareness. Now we move into a layer that most people never consciously examine, and yet it influences their words every single day. Because your internal language is not formed in isolation. It is shaped in relationship. Let me ask you something that may feel uncomfortable. Who would you outgrow if you fully stepped into your power? Who might feel threatened if you started speaking about yourself with confidence? Who might feel distant if you stopped rehearsing the same complaints? Who might struggle if you stopped identifying with struggle? Many of the phrases we repeat are not just survival mechanisms. They are loyalty mechanisms. Loyalty to family narratives. Loyalty to cultural expectations. Loyalty to the version of ourselves that kept us connected to a certain group. If you grew up hearing that people like us don't get ahead, that sentence may have embedded itself as an invisible boundary. If humility was equated with self-diminishment, then bold declarations might feel arrogant. If your environment rewarded sacrifice over ambition, then prosperity might feel like betrayal. And so your language quietly maintains belonging. You say, I don't need much, even when you desire more. You say, I'm not that talented, even when evidence suggests otherwise. You say, it's probably not for me, before even trying. Not because you lack capacity, but because your nervous system associates expansion with separation. There is a concept in psychology called systemic loyalty. It refers to the unconscious commitment to stay aligned with the emotional tone of your family or group. If the emotional baseline was struggle, your internal dialogue may default to struggle. If the baseline was scarcity, your words may unconsciously reinforce scarcity. Because moving beyond it can feel like leaving people behind. And leaving, even symbolically, can activate deep fear. This is why mindset work is rarely just cognitive. It is relational. When you upgrade your language, you are not just shifting thought patterns. You are shifting identity position. You are potentially changing your role within your social system, and that can trigger subtle resistance. Have you ever noticed that when you begin to improve, someone around you becomes uncomfortable? Or that when you speak confidently about a goal, someone minimizes it? Those interactions can unconsciously teach you to soften your declarations, to shrink your vocabulary of possibility. So, instead of saying, I am building something extraordinary, you downgrade it to, I'm just trying something small. Instead of declaring, I am capable of wealth, you say, I just hope it works out. Words adjust to preserve harmony. But here is the deeper question. Is that harmony serving your growth? Or is it preserving an outdated identity contract? Because when you consistently declare smaller versions of yourself to protect belonging, you train your nervous system to equate expansion with danger. And then every time success approaches, internal friction arises. Not because you don't want success, but because you fear what it might cost relationally. This is where conscious awareness becomes powerful. You begin recognizing that some internal phrases are inherited, not chosen. Some limitations are echoes, not truths. Some narratives are cultural scripts you never intentionally authored. And when you see that clearly, something shifts. You realize you are allowed to evolve without abandoning love. You are allowed to expand without disrespecting your origins. You are allowed to rewrite language without betraying your history. But this realization opens another important doorway. Because once you understand that your words are tied to belonging, survival, and identity loyalty, the next question becomes unavoidable. If you are not your inherited script, then who are you choosing to become? And this is the moment where everything begins to reorganize. Because once you see that your language has been shaped by survival, by belonging, by inherited narratives, you can no longer pretend it's random. You start realizing something both confronting and liberating at the same time. You are not stuck. You are being obedient. Obedient to old agreements. Obedient to early conditioning. Obedient to an identity that once made sense. But obedience is not destiny. When you catch yourself saying, "That's just who I am," pause. Is it who you are? Or is it who you learn to be? When you declare, "I've always been this way," ask yourself, always since when? Since childhood? Since a specific failure? Since someone told you something that stuck? Because identity is often a frozen conclusion drawn from an emotionally intense moment. At some point, something happened. You felt embarrassed, rejected, overlooked, criticized, and a sentence formed inside you. Maybe it was subtle. Maybe it was dramatic. But it carried emotion. And because it carried emotion, it engraved itself. And because it engraved itself, you started living from it. This is the power of internal declarations. They crystallize moments into identity. But here's the shift. If identity was constructed through repeated language, it can be reconstructed through conscious language. You are not dismantling yourself. You are redesigning yourself. And that redesign begins with recognizing that the old script is not sacred. It is not permanent. It is not who you are at your core. It is a strategy that once protected you. Now, here's something subtle. When you begin changing your internal vocabulary, when you start replacing "I can't" with "I'm," learning, when you shift from "I'm unlucky" to "I'm building resilience," when you move from "I don't deserve" to "I am expanding my capacity," you may feel cognitive dissonance. That tension is not a sign that you are lying to yourself. It is a sign that your neural pathways are being challenged. Old circuits resist being replaced. They want familiarity. But familiarity is not the same as truth. Every time you consciously declare something aligned with growth, you are issuing a new command to your subconscious. You are training your perception to search for different evidence. You are teaching your nervous system that expansion does not equal danger. And over time, something remarkable happens. The declarations that once felt artificial begin to feel natural. The identity that once felt foreign begins to feel stable. The language of possibility becomes the default instead of the exception. This is not denial of reality. It is participation in reality creation. Because remember, language is not just description. It is construction. And if you are constructing your identity every day through speech, then silence is not neutral. It simply allows old patterns to continue building. So the real question becomes, what identity are you willing to authorize from this point forward? Are you willing to declare growth before you feel completely ready? Are you willing to speak strength while still healing? Are you willing to shift your neurovocabulary, even if your past doesn't yet match your future? Because what we're about to explore next is how to turn this awareness into action, how to implement a practical structure that allows you to interrupt automatic language patterns and consciously install new ones without falling into forced positivity or self-deception. Now, we move into something practical, because awareness without structure fades. Insight without repetition dissolves. And if you don't create a system around your language, your old neurovocabulary will quietly reclaim territory. So let's talk about implementation. If words are declarations, and declarations shape neural pathways, and neural pathways influence perception, behavior, and identity, then you need a daily mechanism that interrupts unconscious language before it solidifies into emotional state. This is where the 5-to-1 principle becomes personal, not theoretical, not philosophical, personal. For every negative internal declaration you catch, and you will catch them, you consciously install 5 aligned declarations, not robotic affirmations, not empty positivity, intentional counterweights. If your mind says, "I always mess this up," you don't argue emotionally. You respond structurally. "I am learning. I am improving. I am capable of adjusting. I have solved things before. I am building competence." This isn't magic. It's neurological conditioning. The brain has negativity bias. It weighs threat more heavily than safety. So one negative phrase often carries more emotional intensity than one positive phrase. The 5-to-1 ratio isn't arbitrary. It compensates for emotional weighting. You're not denying mistakes. You're balancing the biochemical scale. Now, here's the critical nuance. Emotion seals memory. If you say those 5 declarations without feeling, they remain surface level. But when you pause, breathe, and embody them, even slightly, you anchor them deeper. That's why tone matters. That's why pace matters. That's why intention matters. This is not about becoming someone who never experiences doubt. It's about becoming someone who does not let doubt monopolize internal conversation. And here's where most people fail. They try to replace language only when they're in crisis. But reprogramming doesn't happen in crisis. It happens in repetition. You don't wait for a breakdown to practice emotional regulation. You train daily so that when pressure comes, your nervous system has alternative pathways available. Think of it like physical training. You don't build muscle during competition. You build it in repetition before competition. The same applies to identity. Start small. Replace microphrases. Instead of "this is impossible," say "this is unfamiliar." Instead of "I can't handle this," say "I'm developing the capacity." Instead of "nothing ever works," say "some things haven't worked yet." Notice how subtle the shift is. You're not leaping from despair to delusion. You're shifting from collapse to growth orientation. That's the difference between toxic positivity and intentional cognitive restructuring. Now, something else happens when you begin practicing this consciously. You start hearing other people's language differently. You recognize victim scripts, scarcity scripts, fear scripts, and instead of absorbing them, you begin filtering them. Because once you understand that language creates internal reality, you become protective of what you consume and what you repeat. You realize that complaining repeatedly is not catharsis, it's reinforcement. You realize that self-deprecating humor, repeated daily, becomes identity. You realize that "that's just my luck" becomes a prophecy. And here's the powerful part. You also realize that leadership begins internally. The way you speak to yourself determines the energy you bring into every room. If your internal dialogue is harsh, your nervous system is defensive. If your internal dialogue is expansive, your nervous system is open. And openness creates creativity. Creativity creates solutions. Solutions create progress. Language gives emotion, gives action, gives identity. This chain is not abstract. It's operational. But there's still one dimension we haven't fully addressed. Because even if you restructure your spoken language, and even if you apply the 5-to-1 principle consistently, there is a layer beneath conscious speech that determines how sustainable this transformation becomes. And that layer is your internal narrative during silence. when no one is watching, when you're not performing positivity, when you're simply alone with yourself. That's where the real architecture is built. Now, we arrive at the most intimate layer of all, the place where real identity transformation either consolidates or quietly collapses, because everything we've discussed, neurovocabulary, dopamine, cortisol, the 5-to-1 principle, declarations as acts of creation, all of it ultimately converges in one invisible arena, your inner dialogue. Not the words you post, not the words you say in meetings, not the affirmations you repeat in front of others, the words you whisper to yourself when no one is watching, that voice that wakes up with you, that narrator that comments on your reflection, that critic that evaluates your performance, that judge that replays conversations at night, that silent script that runs while you scroll, compare, hesitate, dream. This is where reality is truly constructed, because your inner dialogue is constant. It doesn't pause when the video ends. It doesn't take weekends off. It doesn't wait for motivation. It is shaping neural pathways every single day through repetition and emotional intensity. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people would never tolerate from others the way they speak to themselves internally. They would never call a friend useless. They would never tell a child, "You'll never be enough." They would never look at someone they love and say, "You always ruin everything." But internally, they repeat those scripts daily. And each repetition is not harmless. It is biochemical. It is neurological. It is structural. It activates stress circuits. It reinforces threat perception. It wires identity around deficiency. This is why reprogramming reality requires more than surface positivity. It requires emotional maturity and conscious authorship. You must decide who is allowed to narrate your life. If your inner voice is harsh, your nervous system stays guarded. When the nervous system stays guarded, creativity shrinks. When creativity shrinks, possibility narrows. And when possibility narrows, identity contracts. But when your internal language shifts not into fantasy, but into alignment, your physiology changes. Your breathing deepens. Your body relaxes. Your perception expands. Your problem-solving improves. Your decisions stabilize. This is not mystical thinking. This is cognitive emotional architecture. Now, here is the pivotal shift. You do not need to eliminate negative thoughts. You need to change the authority they hold. When a critical thought appears, instead of fusing with it, you observe it. Instead of believing it automatically, you question it. Instead of repeating it emotionally, you counterbalance it intentionally. You become the editor of your inner script, and editing requires awareness. That's why I invited you earlier to observe for 3 days. Because awareness is the first fracture in automatic programming. Once you see the script, you cannot unsee it. And once you recognize that your words are decrees, you begin to choose them with care. Language is not decoration. Language is direction. Every I am statement is architectural. Every I can't statement is structural. Every this always happens to me statement is a reinforcement beam in the building of identity. So imagine, for a moment, what would change if your inner dialogue sounded like someone who believes in your growth. Not blindly, not unrealistically, but consistently. Imagine waking up and hearing, "I am capable of learning. I am allowed to evolve. I am building something. I am not defined by yesterday. I am becoming." That frequency, and yes, it is a frequency, creates emotional resilience. And resilience changes outcomes, because reality does not organize itself only around circumstances. It organizes itself around perception. And perception is filtered through language. So here is your responsibility now. You are not just someone who uses words. You are someone built by them. The question is no longer whether words create reality. The question is, which reality are you actively constructing every day? If this message resonated, if something shifted inside you, I want you to write in the comments, I choose my words. Not for the algorithm, for yourself. Because declarations begin with awareness. If you felt this conversation move something real inside you, leave a like. It helps this message reach people who are still trapped in unconscious scripts. And if you are ready to deepen this work, to move beyond inspiration and into true reprogramming, subscribe to the channel. Reality Blueprint is not about surface motivation. It's about rebuilding identity from the inside out. And the next video on your screen will take you even further into the hidden scripts that quietly control your decisions and how to dismantle them. Because your transformation doesn't start when circumstances change. It starts when your language does. If you made it all the way here, it's not random. People don't sit through a conversation like this unless something inside them recognized the truth. If you felt even a subtle shift, a pause, a realization, a quiet, this is about me, then this isn't just content for you. This is a turning point. So here's what I want you to do, and I want you to do it intentionally. First, subscribe to the channel, not casually, consciously. Reality Blueprint is not about surface-level motivation. It's about identity reconstruction, neural reprogramming, and deliberate personal transformation. If you're someone who is ready to stop living on autopilot and start designing your inner architecture, then this space is for you. And if you felt something while watching, that's your sign. Second, go to the comments and write exactly this. I choose my words. Not because it sounds good, not because it's trendy, but because declarations matter. And when you type those words publicly, you're reinforcing a new internal contract. You're signaling to your subconscious that from this point forward, your language will be intentional. Your identity will be authored. Your reality will be constructed, not drifted into. Third, leave a like on this video. That simple action helps this message reach someone else who might still be trapped in a destructive inner dialogue. Engagement isn't about vanity metrics. It's about distribution of awareness. When you like the video, you're helping expand this frequency. There isn't a next video waiting for you right now. There's a next decision. Before you click away, ask yourself, what is one sentence you're going to stop repeating after today? And what is one new declaration you're willing to install instead? Transformation doesn't happen through information alone. It happens through repetition, reinforcement, and conscious choice. Through the words you speak when no one is listening. Through the dialogue you allow inside your own mind. This isn't about binge-watching content. It's about interrupting an old script and choosing a new one, deliberately. And if you're still here, you're not just watching, you're already rewriting something.